Elle and I recently finished reading a nonfiction book, and we both loved it. And we're recommending it to anyone we meet. It's one of those books that is about a very specific topic, but the way that it's written, it really gets to the heart of something universal. If there's any slight problem with getting people to read the book, it's in the title. But at the same time, it needs that title because the book is called Forget the Alamo. The reason the title could be a problem is that if you live outside of Texas, it might seem like it could be geared only toward Texans or for those people who are only interested in the Alamo. So if you don't care about any of that stuff, you might wave it off. But again, believe me, there's a lot more to this book than Texas or the Alamo. Now, the title, Forget the Alamo, is, of course, a play on the famous rallying cry of, Remember the Alamo! And if you're of a certain age, regardless of where you grew up, you may at least be familiar with the legend of Davy Crockett as portrayed on TV by Fess Parker and the movies by John Wayne, and the story of how Davy joined the other heroic defenders of that old Spanish mission in San Antonio way back in 1836. Vastly outnumbered, Crockett and that small group fought bravely to the death rather than surrender, all in the cause of liberty, and all while wearing a coonskin cap. At least, if you're like most people, if you know anything about it at all, that is the most common way of remembering the Alamo. It's become a symbol of something greater than itself, in Texas and in many other places. It represents the ideal that even if we face impossible odds, Americans are willing to fight and even sacrifice themselves for a righteous cause. Now, growing up in Texas like I did, and being from Texas is getting harder and harder to admit these days. Anyway, that story of the Battle of the Alamo was taken as the absolute truth, and it was guarded as religious dogma. It is an origin story, and to doubt it was heresy. But even long ago, when I was learning about it in school, and every seventh grader in Texas is required to learn about the Alamo, there were a lot of cracks appearing in the facade of the Alamo story. Who were these guys exactly fighting to the death, and why were they there? So the book, Forget the Alamo, tells us who they really were and why they were there. In a nutshell, they were white slaveholders involved in a land grab from the sovereign nation of Mexico. The liberty they died to preserve was based on the very same racist ideals that led southern states to rebel against the Union and start the Civil War about 25 years later. The fact that they were caught in the Alamo at all mostly proved how foolish and arrogant and entitled these white guys were. Imagine if you invited someone to come stay in your home as long as they obeyed the rules, and you had a rule against raising rattlesnakes in your home. But then your guests started raising rattlesnakes inside your home, and when you pointed that out, they insisted that you were infringing on their sovereign rights, and they aimed a gun at you and told you to leave. That was effectively what happened to the Mexican government. So, in recent decades, a lot of folks have accepted the fact that the cherished creation mythology of Texas and the meaning of what happened at the Alamo bore little resemblance to the truth. It's rather embarrassing to hear that people you once regarded as heroes and who have cities and schools named after them were really a bunch of greedy racists with guns. Some things don't change. And for a lot of folks, rather than face that embarrassment and attempt to right the wrongs that have been done, they instead respond furiously and defensively, the way that, someone caught stealing will blame you for pointing it out to them. How dare you mess with my cherished story that tells me who I think I am? So, Forget the Alamo mostly tells that story of an ongoing cultural battle that we're all caught up in. It's about the harm that's been done and is still being done by clinging to a myth, and the difference between defending that myth and accepting the truth and the healing that truth can bring. There's a good reason, though, we love to hold on to myths. They do tell us who we are. They inform our very identity and sense of self, and so it makes sense that we guard those myths jealously. Problem is, not all myths are positive. In the case of the Alamo myth, for going on 200 years, Mexican Americans have been told that they're unworthy and they're collectively guilty of murder. They've faced discrimination and scorn. Growing up in Texas, generations of Latino kids have had to put up with hearing that they killed Davy Crockett. Christians have behaved the same way toward Jews quite often. I've lost count of how many times I've heard a well-meaning Christian tell me that they really like Jewish people, even if they did kill Jesus, which conveniently ignores the fact that Jesus was Jewish, condemned only by religious leaders, but put to death by Romans who were Gentiles. So sorry to mess with anyone's mythology, but Jews did not kill Jesus. Of course, a bad myth is a hard thing to dispel. One such myth, common in the time of Jesus, was that people who were not perfectly whole, who had a debility of one kind or another, that meant they must have been cursed by God. Either they had somehow sinned grievously, or in the case of someone born with a debility, their parents had to be the ones to blame. We can pawn that off these days as the ignorant beliefs of people who lived in a pre-scientific age, who couldn't fathom the real causes of disease or things like being blind or deaf. And today, plenty of people in the deaf community would chafe at the idea that not being able to hear is a problem. It's a way of being, and it's our problem if we see that as a debility. Nonetheless, in the first century world of Jesus, it was understood as a debility and then some. It meant that something was wrong with you beyond your hearing loss. According to their long-held beliefs that were tightly knit into their concept of how God operates in the world, it meant that you or someone in your family tree had made God really, really mad, and this was your punishment. You must have deserved it. Imagine the burden of bearing that myth for a moment. You might have even believed it yourself. But then you, the deaf person who also has a speech impediment, almost certainly, because you can't hear how everyone else is forming words, you're taken to see this man named Jesus. People are talking to you about Jesus, not only because you can't hear and you can't speak well, but because the myth they assign to you assumes that you are even more deeply flawed, that God has cursed you, and word's gotten around that Jesus can lift curses. So Jesus takes you aside in private, touches your ears and your tongue, and says, "Be opened." And suddenly you can hear and speak like a TV anchorman. All Jesus said was, "Be opened," and everything changed. Not just the story people believed about you, but the myth you'd assumed was right about yourself. You're healed. You're free. And not only of physical limitations, your whole life has been liberated. Now, when we read one of these stories about Jesus performing a miracle, it's important to appreciate that in every single instance, there are at least two dimensions to it. The first is the most obvious. A physical change has happened in someone. Our modern, scientifically informed minds might wonder, well, did this really happen? Does a story like this itself fall into a category of myth? I guess it's interesting to ponder stuff like that, but doing it too much is sort of like a dog chasing its own tail. You're going to discover the tail is still there and you're never going to catch it, no matter how hard you try. There are some things we'll just never know. And I personally am fine with saying Jesus performed miracles because I tend to believe that anything is possible with God, and it's not my prerogative to place limits on what God's love can do. And doubting a miracle story, well, it misses the real point anyway. And the real point is the second dimension to any miracle story. It's not always as obvious, but it's the most important part because it tells the story of why. Why bother giving someone clear hearing and perfect speech? What does it demonstrate to the person who has been healed and to the people standing around in utter amazement? Well, what's the meaning of it? Well, to answer that, we ought to look at the overall story of Jesus and what he was doing as he traveled through the country teaching and encountering people. Every single thing Jesus did that's recorded for us and every word he spoke was consistently about the same thing. He said, "I'm here to proclaim that God's up to something new, and you are an important part of that." In fact, God's really been this way all along, Jesus says, but over time, people have woven all these unnecessary rules and laws and myths about how God works and lives through us. And all that stuff has done more harm than good. All that myth making that says that you're inherently damaged goods and how valuable you are and how loved you are is based on how closely you follow a bunch of religious doctrines. I'm here to prove, Jesus said over and over again, how completely wrong all of that is. So Jesus was a myth buster, and he proved it by opening ears and freeing people to speak and giving sight to the blind and even restoring the dead back to life, all to show that the burdensome accumulation of guilt and shame and fear and worry that organized religion had drilled into you is a myth. All the hot-aired preachers who've condemned and warned and scolded and made you feel unworthy. All the tall tales of hellfire and damnation. All the indoctrination that says, in order for our beliefs to be correct, that means all other beliefs must be false. And don't you dare ask any questions because that's a slippery slope. Any faith that's always in need of a manufactured enemy to do spiritual warfare with, all that stuff is a myth. It's a very bad myth. To all of that, Jesus simply said, be opened, be free. We have a lot more important things to do than worry about whether or not we're valuable and loved and accepted as we are. Jesus never qualified anyone that way, and he went out of his way to welcome and embrace and love the very people that all those myths insisted were somehow defective. It's a given that we're immensely valuable and loved and accepted by God if our ears and our eyes and our voices and our hearts are simply open to that truth. Jesus said no one is defective. You are good because God loves you as you are. And it's high time to spread that good news and get out there and do good for the sake of each other, to counter the bad old myths that divide people against each other, that categorize people as worthy or unworthy, that ever claim that God's love is somehow conditional, to actually get back into living in and acting out the greatest origin story ever told, that we were all created good. That goodness lives within us and in each of our neighbors, and our job is to point out that truth and to live out that truth. That is the cherished myth, the true story telling us who we are at the core of our being. The power of love lets us be open to that so that we can live as the beautiful, good creations that we are, liberated, healed, and free.